Day 7 and letting go of food guilt. This is such a massive one, and if I'd have asked myself, even probably 5 or 6 years ago, would I ever live in a time where I didn't feel guilty about food and about eating, and I would never have believed that that was possible. And the last 6 years have been a combination of recognizing the feelings when I feel them and learning to sort of be an observer of them and not react to them, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about. But also what I've noticed is the more I build in some of the stuff we've already been talking about this week, the more I eat regularly, the more I step away from food rules, the more I give myself permission to eat, the less of the guilt and shame invitations, if you like, actually come up for me. And it's a really interesting one, with things that we identify that we want to change, we often tackle them head on, and it's the unconscious mind will often resist anything that we try to tackle head on, because it's clever and it's sneaky, and so we have to be sneaky and we have to approach things not quite so directly. So today we are going to look at releasing and letting go of food guilt. So there is a workbook as always, but I just want to first off start talking about the roots of our food guilt, the roots of shame. And like most of the things that I've talked about, so much of this stuff starts in childhood, where we may be. I will recall a story there when I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, and it was a Friday, and my dad went over to the off licence, and he came back with some beer for himself, I'm sure, but a bag of different chocolate bars, and he put them all on the table, and I grabbed a Turkish delight, I think it was, and then my sister took something, and I banged my fist on the table and said I wanted that. And I can remember being told off, being told I was greedy. So it's in those little moments where things happen and our natural reactions around food come out, and we experience some kind of shaming or invitation to feel guilty about our behaviours around food. So certainly our experiences in childhood influence, but a massive culprit that really invites this whole guilt and shame cycle is diet culture. And we've already talked about the good and bad food lists, and how us adhering to these really unrealistic and really rigid rules often sees us. It kind of comes from in my experience, there's kind of two things that we measure our food and eating by that invite us to feeling guilty, and you'll probably relate to these. The first one that invites guilt is that we tell ourselves that we've eaten too much, and the other one is that we tell ourselves that the food we have eaten is unhealthy. Now, this isn't, we can get into a conversation as to how much is too much and what foods are unhealthy, and that very much looks at it from the physical perspective of food in terms of its nutritional quality and stuff like that. But we've already established that our food relationship is not just about the physical, it's about the emotional as well. So there will be, and for each of us, we will have a different parameter that we use that determines that we've eaten too much or we've eaten too unhealthy food, because it's those two things that really become the driving force behind us starting to judge and question. And it's that judgment and questioning that leads to us feeling guilty. And often that process, if we could kind of get into our brains and slow that process down, because it happens so quickly. It can even happen during eating. I can remember times where I'd be eating something and I'd be feeling guilty while I was eating it. So, what we're going to start to look at today is we're going to look at why you feel guilty. I'm also going to get you to look at what is that guilt trying to tell you? And that's a really interesting one when we actually start to flip it and we start to look at these emotions that we're experiencing. Why are we experiencing them? But also, what might these emotions be trying to tell us? So again, just starting to look at why why do we get invited into guilt? Often it's because we've developed such a perfectionist view of how we should and shouldn't be eating. You know, those shoulds and shouldn'ts are another kind of food rule, aren't they? And this stuff expands outside of our food, but for this program we are looking at it from a food perspective. So the very finger wagging shoulds and oughts, you know, invite us into having these really tight parameters around food. And when we have these really rigid, tight parameters, the minute we kind of step over that mark, that's when we start to make judgments, and that's when that guilt and shame starts to rise. But guilt and shame isn't just something that comes whilst it's the way we think and feel that creates the guilt. There can also be external influences as well. So certain things people say, or certain environments and stuff, you know, we've touched on environment, you know, but there can be external factors that feed into us creating a story, and that story then brings up the emotion of guilt. So today we are going to explore those guilty feelings, and we're going to look at how to release some of that guilt, because it is such a disempowering feeling, and it is so intrinsically linked to our food, our eating, and our bodies. So download your workbooks, guys, and what we're going to look at today, we're going to have a look at why do you feel guilty, and there's an opportunity to just maybe sit and think about the last time you can remember feeling guilty around food or eating, and then just to work through those questions. And I've put in a little example there. So there's 4 questions there. You know, why did you feel guilty? Sorry, I haven't written those questions down. They're in the workbook. So I've given you an example I've gone through, and it's starting to help you look at the origin. So it's looking at the time you felt guilty, but starting to track back and think about where was the origin of that belief first originated. And I used one around carbs. For me, I recalled a situation where I ate a couple of bowls of pasta and felt guilty about that. And when I started to explore that, I know that that's intrinsically linked to my 20s when I did the Atkins diet, where I was very much eating protein and developed the belief that carbs were bad. And so, of course, when you eat them, that brings up that's an invitation to feel guilty. There's a judgment there based upon an old rule that was made back in my 20s. So the first thing you can do today, guys, is start to look at your own feelings of guilt and try to choose one scenario to work through. And this is something, these are little experiments or little techniques that you can get into a habit of using more and more, and they become really powerful. It's all about raising awareness, and the more awareness that we can raise in the moment, the more helpful that will be. Remember I said about guilt, you know, we can actually deal with the guilt when we're experiencing it, and I'm going to talk you through a process for that. But ideally, the more upfront work we can do, the more we can actually stop falling in the river, if you like. I love that that saying, you know, instead of pulling people out of the river, let's go upstream and find out why they're falling in. That's what we're kind of trying to do here. We're trying to establish what is it that's going on that triggers the guilt feelings for you. And the first 2 parts of today's work is around that. So number 2 is to start looking at what is the guilt trying to teach you. Emotions are there for a reason. Emotion is just energy. Emotion is there to, like an alarm bell going, hello, you're ignoring something, don't ignore me, what's going on? So the second part is about you starting to explore what are those feelings of guilt, what is that energy of guilt trying to teach you. And it's lovely when you can actually start to see that it is like your body saying to you, stop, something is going on here. The next part, we are going to start looking at releasing guilt. We have already started coming up with some lovely front end stuff that I talk about again in your workbook. Things like keep working on your food rules, keep working on recognizing your hunger cues, eating when you're a 3 or a 4 and not a 7 or an 8. You know, stopping when you're at about a 6 to 8 and not when you're at a really, really 9 or 10 when you're really full. So these are the things we've already talked about this week. If you carry on working on them, they are going to start to help build a really um, more balanced approach in the front end. And when you are building a balanced approach, the less likely you are to get into the mindset of the judgment of I've overeaten or I've eaten the wrong foods. So that's kind of what we're trying to settle down. We're trying to settle down that part of you that makes a judgment. And the judgments come when we're not balanced with our eating and our thinking. So the more we can work on the front end, the less guilt you're likely to experience. But we're going to look at 3 areas today. One is awareness, and there's a bit of work for you to do around that. The second one is mantras. I am not a massive fan of positive thinking. They often come from the conscious mind, which, they have a place. They have a place, but they have to be repeated regularly in order for that to be, for the conscious mind and the unconscious mind to start to integrate. So mantras, and I've given you some examples of mantras around releasing guilt, things that you can say to yourself around some of your food rules and things like that. And you're going to have an opportunity today to come up with your own mantra, something that feels right for you and something that you can start to say to yourself on a regular basis that is going to start to change those beliefs and those pathways in your brain. The next little exercise I'm going to get you to do is sitting with your feelings. Now, this program is not about emotional eating. That in itself is a massive chunk of work and something that I work in depth in my 12-week program. But we are going to look at the feeling of guilt. So you are going to have an opportunity to sit with those feelings. Quite often, especially when we are looking at emotional eating, we're so resistant to experiencing and feeling what we're feeling that food becomes a way that we eat to push those feelings down. And for some people, they've done that for so many years, it's just become a habit for them. But part 3 of the releasing the feelings of guilt is to actually learn to sit with them. And there's a little exercise there that talks you through how to start to become an observer of your thoughts rather than a reactor of your thoughts. So the final thing, once you've gone through today's exercise, is to then set a little action plan for yourself. Obviously, don't try and tackle everything at once, but the whole aim of this 7 days is to kind of give you some ideas that you can start to actually work on them, small steps every single day. So the last part of today's exercise, guys, is to set yourself a little action plan about some of the things you can do that will help you to start letting go of guilt, or also reducing how much guilt you actually experience. So this is the last day of official trainings. So we've done 1 to 7. Tomorrow I'm going to pop on and just do a summary of what we've worked through and then get you thinking about what the next steps are. So see you all tomorrow.